Since its launch in February 2023, the selection of Game Boy Color titles available on Nintendo Switch Online has steadily increased, with its number of titles rivaling its older brother, the Game Boy. Most of these already released titles include some genuinely amazing games, like Pokemon Trading Card Game and The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Ages. It also has played host to several oddball picks like Quest for Camelot and Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, truly showing off the variety that the system has to offer. Despite this growing library, there are many more amazing games for the Technicolor handheld that deserve some recognition. For this list, I want to focus on some underappreciated titles that few people might have played. We could discuss more obvious picks like Mario Tennis and golf games, for example, or even the likes of Pokemon Pinball, but those feel like more inevitabilities. So let's look at some of the hidden gems and lesser known treasures for the Game Boy Color that would be a welcome sight on the Nintendo Switch. Capcom has done an excellent job keeping the Mega Man series relevant on modern hardware with its Legacy Collection releases. However, some spin-offs and handheld titles have slipped through the cracks, which is where Mega Man Xtreme comes into the picture. While a full remaster wouldn't make much sense, releasing it on the Switch seems more ideal. Xtreme is essentially the 8-bit remake of Mega Man X and X2 with stages and bosses from both games present. It ends up playing just as well as its Super Nintendo counterparts. The original's challenging gameplay remains, as does the fantastic music. Further, the iconic stage themes have been recreated excellently on the Game Boy Color hardware, and the graphics are impressive for the handhelds. The Game Boy Color's small screen size can make the difficulty feel a little cheap at times, but overall it doesn't make this any less heart-pounding and exciting to play. Magical Chase GB is definitely one you can call a hidden gem of the Game Boy Color library. A Japanese-only port of the TurboGrafx 16 game of the same name, Magical Chase GB is an adorable-looking shooter that would be an excellent addition to the Switch Online library. Starring the young witch named Ripple, you shoot through colorful stages filled with bizarre and adorable foes to defeat 6 sinister demons. It's a simple but charming game with bold, colorful graphics full of personality. You can buy upgrades for health from shops partway through the stages to change up your strategy before the bosses. While not exceptionally long, these games are incredibly replayable, and bite-sized fun is always right at home on the handheld. The language barrier isn't a problem for this one either, as very little text prevents the game from being played for a Western audience. Even if it doesn't make its way to the NSO server, you should keep an eye on it for the future if you haven't heard of it until now. It's a whimsical and endearing cute-em-up worthy of your attention. The Game Boy era was full of games that tried to capture just a little bit of what made Pokemon a household name. While Konami's Azure Dreams certainly has some of that flavor, it's much more interesting as an engaging and strategic dungeon crawler. As the crimson-haired protagonist, you venture into the monster tower that looms over your village to make money and unearth what happened to your long-lost father. The combat is straightforward and your monster companions will attack on their own, but you have your attacks too, so you're not just relying on your monsters for protections. From the get-go, Azure Dreams has an engaging gameplay loop that sees you diving back in, starting fresh each time as you try to make it a little further, as you'd find in a typical roguelike today. With over 100 creatures to tame, you could sink a lot of time into this one. Another game that never released outside of Japan is Samurai Kid, a puzzle platformer in which players control a young samurai prince on his quest to defeat a demon king and rescue a princess. The game's mechanics are simple to grasp, but even after the early stages, it's easy to see how the later puzzles could get trickier, with new layers getting progressively added as players play. Gameplay revolves around using your 3 key weapons to interact with the environment. The large gourd can turn enemies into blocks, your sword can cut through certain walls, and your fan can anger enemies and lead them into more favorable positions. While each level is self-contained, there's an incentive to return to each level after gaining more skills to earn more power-ups. Also, each level has a ranking system, challenging players to see how fast they can finish. With the very little text needing translation and extremely intuitive gameplay systems, Samurai Kid feels like a game that deserves a second chance. The first game in Konami's Lost in Blue series is called Survival Kids. You begin the game shipwrecked on a mysterious island with no sign of civilization. So, you must use your little survival knowledge to maintain your hunger, thirst, and energy levels. The survival elements keep things moving forward so you can constantly look for fresh food and water sources. Your collected items can root or degrade, so you can't rest for any moment. This game requires a bit of patience. You might have to look up a guide if you get started. Walking in without much knowledge of how the game works will swiftly lead to a morbid end for any who play. But this sort of hardcore survival gameplay is pretty commonplace these days, and it's interesting to see this sort of gameplay attempted back in the day. With a non-linear approach to progression and many endings to unlock, Survival Kids is an experience to get lost in. I wouldn't usually include licensed games on a list like this, but this charming little game is a bit of a special case. While Pax Softmatica developed it, Nintendo ended up publishing it. This could be described as a hamster linguistics simulator. In it, you travel through your neighborhood, talk to other hamsters, and fill out a dictionary. Each word you learn has a purpose in solving puzzles and recruiting your fellow ham-hams for your clubhouse. While it isn't a highly complex game, it is adorable and very wholesome, not only in gameplay concept, but also in its presentation. It feels like an entry-level adventure game, but it's one that older players could enjoy too, so long as they don't take it too seriously. This game, along with its GBA sequel, gets very little attention these days, but introducing them to newer generations with Nintendo Switch Online would be a nice treat. Real-time strategy games are seldom released on anything other than PC, and for the most part, you can probably understand why. Their complexities often require many more buttons than consoles usually have, so the experience ends up watered down. While Warlocked from Bit Studios simplifies the experience, it does so in ways that still make it extremely enjoyable. It's incredible what they pull off with the few GBC buttons available. This fantasy RTS feels perfectly crafted for the system, as each map is catered to be a short burst of tactical goodness. It's got base building and resource gathering, plus the various wizards and warlocks you can recruit to your cause keeps each level of the two campaigns feeling fresh. And you don't just have to do this on their own, as there are several multiplayer maps to unlock. Nintendo has done an excellent job keeping these handheld multiplayer modes alive on NSO, so we only hope that Warlocked would receive the same support. We've already included one monster battler on this list, and just as Azure Dreams takes a slightly different approach to the genre, Dragon Warrior Monsters takes the Pokemon formula and spices it up with traditional trimmings and mechanics as a Dragon Quest game. Of course, Dragon Quest is a series with iconic monster designs, so it's already primed for this sort of gameplay, and it's pretty incredible just how well it slips into these shoes. Playing as a young boy named Terry, you must tame and forge a bond with a team of monsters to save your kidnapped sister. Combat is pretty similar to what's found in other Dragon Quest games, although you do none of the fighting yourself and your monsters all fight for you. By changing their tactics, you can alter how they'll behave during battle and overcome the many other tamers that you come up against. With the new installment in the side series recently hitting the Switch, bringing the original to Nintendo Switch Online would be ideal for showing fans where it all began. In a series as storied as Resident Evil, it's no surprise there are many spin-off titles, but Resident Evil Gaiden is often overlooked. While it's not a one-to-one recreation of the Resident Evil formula and takes some liberties with its gameplay style, it does it mainly for the better in my opinion. Playing as Barry Burren, you must infiltrate a cruise ship to find Leon, who has gone missing while investigating a new bioweapon. Exploration is done from a top-down perspective, and as always, you must search for items while avoiding the grasping clutches of the ship's zombified inhabitants. Combat, however, takes a different approach. Rather than aiming and shooting in the traditional way, when you lock onto an enemy, you are sent to an RPG-like battle screen where you must time your button presses to do damage. It's unconventional but surprisingly fun, and it makes the combat very tense, as you must make each shot count. While it's mainly considered non-canon today, it's remarkably playable and has unique gameplay elements that highlights what makes survival horror games so appealing. With Konami's recent release of Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, there is a chance that this one might appear in the eventual Volume 2. But still, if it doesn't, there'd be no better home for it than the Nintendo Switch Online. This handheld iteration of the classic stealth series sees Solid Snake doing what he does best in smaller proportions. The gameplay harkens back to the original Metal Gear games while providing new gameplay elements and a completely original story to help give this installment its identity. Without a doubt, this is one of the best ways to play Metal Gear on the go back in the day, and even in these days it's worthy of praise for just how well it replicates the signature espionage action of its bigger brother on PlayStation 1. While it doesn't come up much during conversation, it's more than worthy of joining the Nintendo Switch Online library so that people can experience this forgotten entry in one of gaming's most beloved franchises. And that's our list. Be sure to let us know what Game Boy Colors you're looking forward to playing on the Nintendo Switch Online, or ones that we may have overlooked, in the comments below.